Welcome to the fourth in a series of panel presentations on environmental and natural resources topics, hosted by the University of Denver Stern College of Law and Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck. Today our panel will discuss water supply and its role in economic growth throughout the state of Colorado. The panel today will focus on water trends in Colorado, the ongoing push and pull between urban water use and rural water use, and how this will impact the state's future success.
Drought is a recurring theme for folks who live in the West, folks who live in Colorado. And I guess just framing the big picture, which John did as well, growing demands on limited resource. This has been an activity, a discussion that's been going on for a long time. It's been heightened in the last 10 years since we had the drought of 2002. But most recently, the work the state of Colorado has done through the State Water Supply Investigation and all the documentation and reports they did in 2010 helped give us a better picture about existing uses and growth projected for the state. And I think I'll focus slightly on a lot of different things, but I want to get back to the theme of whether or not our values today as a society match up with the system of water rights and water allocation we have. As Jim was mentioning just a moment ago, the prior appropriation was and is the foundation of water rights in Colorado, the notion of first in time, first in right, use it or lose it. These are concepts you've heard, or if you haven't, you can take a water law class here at DU and hear about them. But as Jim said, this has led to some very it's complicated for transactions to take place to make water uses more flexible, and it has also, the doctrines are very old. They date from the time when Colorado was settled, initially by miners and folks who were growing food for them. And it's only in the last 2 or 3 decades where we've seen an interest and a focus on in-stream values. And the prior appropriations legacy, because it focused for 150 years on taking water out of streams for mining, agriculture, and growing towns, has left less water in streams. You'll see it even in wet years, and certainly in average or dry ones, you'll see less water than you might imagine should be in stream. And that's because the system protecting in-stream values is fairly new. That's an important thing, and I'll try to circle back to that at the end. Water and the environment, on the next slide, just to note that our values have changed for folks who were born and raised in Colorado in the last 50, 60 years. I myself moved here as a 2.5-year-old, but the fact that rivers themselves provide a lot of economic and beneficial value to cities, sustain the environment, the fish that we like to fish for, the water quality that we enjoy, and in a recent study articulated that there's about 80,000 jobs in Colorado that depend on water-based recreation, and roughly $6.4 billion from the industry, that everything from snowmaking to river rafting and fishing. There's a whole lot of benefit to those waters in the stream. I want to back up to the larger basin as a whole, and on the next slide, just take a snapshot of what's going on in the Colorado River Basin. As Jim mentioned, Denver takes about half of its water from the West Slope, and it's true that across the 7 basin states, that's a very common theme. California and Phoenix and Las Vegas all take water from the same river, and this supply and demand graphic shows you pretty clearly that we reached a threshold just about in the last decade where demand, the red line, has continued to go on an upward trend for the last 100 years, whereas the supply line has been more erratic, and certainly if you look in the last 10 years or so at the right end of the graphic, the levels of water provided by the basin as a whole are less than they were in 1922 when folks signed the compact that shared the water between the states. The next graph, borrowed from Eric Kuhn, the River District's director, in his report from 6 years ago called A Story for the Quest of Certainty in a Diminishing River, shows very graphically at the far right, when the compact negotiations were going on in 1922, there was an extremely direct period of record. They were looking back at a prior 10 or 15 years where flows in the Colorado River were quite large and well above the average yield of the basin. And this graphic all the way to the far left is going back to 1500. You can see that the presumed average of how much was available, if we had assumed there were 15 million acre feet, that upper line, that might have been right for the period of record they were looking at, or looking back over 100 years, but you see over the 500 years here, we could be much lower. We could be looking at something more like 13 or 14 million acre-feet as a basin that's available. So that has important implications, especially for the upper basin, because as that deal was struck, the upper basin is actually the basin states. The 4 upper basin states are going to have a shrinking pie. So we can talk more about that. The next graphic just shows some implications. This is a temperature and a projected volume study that was done, cited by Eric Kuhn, done by some climatologists, and that red line is the temperature line going up to the dash line, which was present at the time they put the study together, showing increasing temperature, statistically significant increases in Colorado, especially in the spring months, and most prominent in the north central mountains. And they projected here the volumes. The right axis shows the 15 million acre-feet basin-wide as kind of the midline, and it shows the fluctuation above and below that over the last many decades, but it shows a projection going forward of much less than the 15 million acre-feet per year. So a very interesting challenge. What does that mean for our future? This is a picture of a floating outhouse on Lake Powell. That's not meant to mean our future is that difficult, but you see in the background there is a bathtub ring. That bright colored rock is what used to be underwater. And that bathtub ring means we are facing a future where Lake Powell and Lake Mead may, over the course of time, not function and provide all the benefits they may have in the past. A quick look at the snowpack. Decreasing snowpack is the norm. Just wanted to point out here, the red line is an average, 100%, that was average snowpack, but just this year, they shifted the 30-year average. They look back over what's average compared to the last 3 decades. And the average over that time has been dropping, so that we actually have a new average. We're now using a new average. So when you hear 90% of average compared to the last 30 years, that's actually, that would have been a different, it would be even worse if we looked over a longer, the average from the 10 years or 30 years prior. Interestingly, the graph I stuck on that far right there, the red line, I did this based on April 1st snowpack. That was accurate as of April 1st, but now it's closer. The statewide average today, I think, was 88%. So it's actually bumped up a bit just in the last 3 weeks, as we might talk about. Next graphic shows results of a study, a draft study that the State Water Conservation Board put together, looking at what might happen out in 2070 to flows. This is the Colorado River main stem near Cameo, that's upstream of Grand Junction. And the thing that I want you to note here is the shift that's going on, the projected shift in this flows in this river. Both the lower average peak flow, the absolute height of that graphic, is projected to be lower in the future. The shift to the left, meaning an earlier runoff period by as much as a month, and the base flows at the kind of the center right of the graph. At the bottom, you see in August and September base flows in the river are projected to be much lower. And so I'll sum up kind of the issue of risk overall. The projections of future climate change tie into what Eric Kuhn put together in his graphic here. It's at the tail end of that study from 2007, just showing that how much water do we have left as a state to develop from the Colorado River beyond what we've already developed. And he puts these in different categories of probably very little or no risk for an additional 150,000 acre-feet. But as we go and assume different levels of development, of additional development, we get up into areas of much higher risk with big implications for existing water users, because the new uses on the system that pull from the Colorado may push us up to a level that tip over the apple cart and actually requires some creative thinking for maintaining existing uses. In the next 5 minutes, I'm going to touch on just several other brief topics that are related to the basin's water use and some of the areas of growth. The next one's about power plants in the West. The black ones here are coal plants, the red ones are gas plants that show relative size, but it shows the water consumption has been the energy industry has actually been part of the issue. It's not just cities and mines and farms, but energy companies that run power plants have been taking water from streams and evaporating it up. The next graphic shows a little bit of a bright lining in that consumption by power generation has actually peaked. I think it's already peaked for our region. It may go up again, but recently with the advent of more wind power and more gas replacing what coal used to be, or new plants being gas instead of coal, we're actually using less water. And the graphic that shows water intensity at power generation kind of paints this picture really clearly. Here you can see and this one's worth about 10 minutes of discussion, so we won't spend that much time on it, but traditional forms of generation like coal and gas on the left-hand side have a certain amount of water use per kilowatt hour, per megawatt hour generated. But over in the right, towards the right end of the graph, you see some of the new technologies. And I just point out that wind and solar photovoltaic actually use no water, so they are more drought resistant. Moving forward with energy, we can hope that we can make energy less of an imprint as we rely more on renewable sources, spend more time on making our homes more efficient and doing things to decrease the demand in the first place. A graph or two here just on oil and gas development. The new kid on the block, at least in the sense that it's new to the Front Range of Colorado, it's now showing up in neighborhoods like the subdivision pictured here. It's been around, oil and gas development, for a long time, but what's true is that in places like Weld County in Colorado, a lot of new wells drilled, and the fracking technology does use a significant chunk of water. It's not large compared to agriculture's use, but it is significant when we talk about water that's used by cities. And as we go through, advance to the next graph, just shows a little breakdown of studies from both the state and Chesapeake, a company that looks at how much water is used for drilling and fracking. And the next frame kind of adds it up into the range of water used just this past year, somewhere between 22,000 and 40,000 acre feet of water. So that number is a pretty big number. That is equivalent to how much cities of very modest size might use, 80,000 families, if you count the fact that the water used in fracking is permanently lost to the system. It's injected and kept underground. And the water that cities use can be reused. Some of the indoor use, all of it, 95% of it gets back into the stream. That volume of water actually supplies enough for as many as 300,000 folks. And so that compares, the next graph shows that the size of the range of 20 to 40,000 acre feet is very much in the realm of the yield of some of the projects that are proposed, like the Moffett Collection expansion that Jim mentioned just a moment ago, the Windy Gap firming project. These are similar sized. So big projects going in to provide new water for cities are not that different in size from those that are providing water to this new emerging energy. And the final graph on this topic is just reference to many cities that you saw in news stories last year, leasing water to energy companies. And there's many Front Range cities that are doing that. It makes them a lot of money, but it raises some very interesting questions about long-term, whether that's something the cities will continue to be in the game of, and whether citizens, many of whom have been concerned about that. But it is probably the most obvious source of water for energy companies. So I want to flip finally to some good proactive solutions. Jim listed many of these. I just want to highlight a couple reports. I brought a few executive summaries here. And these are efforts that Western Resource Advocates and other nonprofits have worked up in the last several years, have gotten good data from the state of Colorado and cities around the Front Range. And I'm very gratified to hear Jim in particular mention many of the elements, common sense approaches going forward. They're not brand new ideas. The question is going to be about how aggressively we implement things like conservation and sharing with agriculture. So just quickly, and John actually went through this, the change or growth in the South Platte population. We're going to see a couple million people. The next slide shows, in a summary form, the many different means where we can meet the demands, both new projects of modest size, reuse, and water conservation, as well as sharing water with agriculture. And briefly going through those, supply side, we're going to see new projects. We're very likely to see the Moffett project, and the Windy Gap Firming project is even further along. We're also going to see projects like Chatfield Reservoir, where they're going to reallocate storage space left empty for use by farms and cities. This makes a lot of sense to use existing buckets. We've already made an impact on a stream system, and it's going to have a bit less impact there than a brand new stream system. Water conservation and efficiency. As Governor Hickenlooper said just early this year, every conversation about water should start with conservation. And the programs that Denver Water and others have done, rates, adjusting their price per water, the rebate programs, and the retrofits of existing landscapes and indoor uses are really important. And basically, the question about what we can do with future residents, we can decrease the footprint of the future residents, the water footprint. The 3 million people that haven't moved here yet, that are projected to in the next 30 years, there's no reason that their levels of water use will be the same or should be the same as those who live here now. And just a couple other, we've run through a few examples. Indoor water use here, kind of a graphic showing typical water use indoors, broken into different types of fixtures, toilets and others. And the conserving home, down around 45 gallons per capita per day. I think if we took a snapshot today and compared it to 20 years from now, a panel like this, you'd see most homes in the metro area closer to 45 or 50 gallons per person per day indoors. Outside, xeric lawns, and the water footprint of consumptive use outside. There's no reason that you can't have a beautiful landscape that looks good in drought and in wet times by taking a little of the turf, having less turf and more of the xeric drought-tolerant plants. And a couple other topics just to mention that are inside the Filling the Gap report. Reuse. Denver has been really at the forefront of this with the large reuse plants, and other northern Colorado cities have developed that. And Aurora, folks have mentioned Aurora's Prairie Waters Project. Really, it's a potable water project. The water actually comes back and is consumed by people, as opposed to Denver's reuse plant mostly puts water for industrial and irrigation uses. But reuse of any kind is going to be a good way to make better use of what we've already developed. And as Jim was saying, the infrastructure we've already put in the system, you don't have to build, you have to build some new reuse infrastructure, but you're making use of the water. You've already spent a lot of time and energy getting through the mountains, taken from another basin or perhaps purchased from other sources. And then finally, ag-urban cooperation. John mentioned this briefly. I think the notion of voluntary and compensated transfers, temporary in nature, between farms and cities has grown in the last decade. We've seen more cities have dry year lease arrangements where they have the ability to take back and use water that farmers would use normally. Is going to be an upward swing. So cruising through in the last 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to touch on how we can protect river flows, how that has been done, and how that can be done in the future. And I'll just mention briefly on the next graphic the federal, state, and other ways we can do that. Federal Reserve water rights, though they're not very common, not great in number. We had a really an amazing one take place in the middle of the last decade, 8-year process to get a water right for Black Canyon to Gunnison National Park. A very interesting process that involved lawsuits, but also ultimately had a bunch of people from the basin, federal, state, local entities, conservation groups like mine, sitting down and hashing out a solution everyone could live with. The next slide shows kayak courses. That's something that if you had this panel 10, 12 years ago, it would be virtually unheard of, but the Golden case, where the city of Golden had a kayak course, went to the Supreme Court, looking at the issue of whether or not kayaking is as beneficial use as other uses we've had for 150 years. The court's unwavering answer on that is yes, it is a beneficial use. So a lot of cities have gone into the business of recreation and put rocks in the rivers to have kayak courses that generate millions of dollars in their local economies. State-based in-stream flows, this is the program the state has had for 30 years or more. A very important program, protects mostly headwater streams on national forest lands and BLM. What's coming up now are more of these difficult and challenging midstream issues. If you're further down a river and you're in the mix of a lot of other water users, it's more challenging to protect in the stream flow. There's more people that might be concerned about that, but we've been involved in a couple. I mentioned the one here, Dominguez Canyon. The next slide was a very clever thing through the federal wilderness bill that passed in 2009. There was actually the designation of Dominguez Canyon Wilderness. It listed some important federal purposes because it was federal law, but it also articulated that how the flows would be protected there are through state law. So it said the state of Colorado would have the first crack at finding ways to protect flows on that federal land. And a very successful outcome there from my perspective, where both existing water users got a little allowance for future development. The folks who might be grazing or storing water further up in the basin were allowed to store a little bit more over the course of time. But the river itself gets 99% of the flow in that particular basin. It's a pretty wildernessy area, not a lot of development there, but a very interesting outcome where flows are protected under state law. And finally, just to prompt a few questions, what is the future going to bring for the state as a whole? I think there are a lot of real interesting questions in front of us, both about projects that are proposed, and Jim mentioned Moffett in particular, There are many others out there. There are projects that are either inside of a National Environmental Policy Act process or even proposals to take water from other states. There's been a basin study that some referenced had some really grandiose ideas about bringing water and pipelines from the Missouri River system. And I think we need to put our attention closer to home, where we know the people and the law and can work out solutions among ourselves and not foist our troubles on folks in other states. So I think the future is going to be a real interesting one. And I think we need to find both ways to meet human needs, both for farming, for cities, and to recognize that the values of the citizenry as a whole have changed and have really important values for water in stream. And we have a real challenge, I think, to address all of those. But I think it's something we can be all excited about participating in. So thanks very much.